Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you have had a good day so far. In our time together today, what I'd like to do is real quick go over some things related to our last programming assignment that are reflective of things uh, that various people in the class missed. So even if you got a perfect score, definitely take note of some of the things that we're going to talk about here, as they might represent mistakes that you, of course, would not want to make in the future. And for those of you that have any questions related to that most recent homework assignment, be sure to ask them as we go through this. And so we'll take a few moments, go through these points, and then handle any questions you have along the way or when we are finished, and then turn our attention to new content for today. So I real quickly put together a few moments ago a program that, while it does not encompass all of the elements of the first program you were asked to write for homework, does incorporate several of the things for sake of illustrating what we are going to talk about here. Clearly, one of the major elements of your homework was to give you the opportunity to define your own structure and get the ability to practice filling that structure with information. And so you were asked to create the structure, create two instances of that structure, fill it with data, and output it in two different formats. Just some general comments. There were some of you that in your structure definition used string as the data type for first name, for last name, and there may have been other elements related to the address where that would be appropriate as well, and that's fine. There were some of you that used C as the data type and specified a length, and that would be fine. There were some of you that did the very unusual thing of mixing those, and I don't really know what the purpose of that would be. I would say that in general, you would want to pick one or the other and stick with it consistently for your character-based data types. And so in my illustration here, I have used string. If you use C, for example, and set a length of, let's say, 50 or 80 or whatever have you, that would be equally appropriate, but don't mix or match those things. I'm going to talk about some elements of this in kind of no particular order here. One of the things that you had to do was output the person's name. And one of the rules of thumb that we discussed that a lot of you missed in putting together your program is, remember that our rule is one chained write statement for each line of output. So if I want to output the first name, the middle initial, and the last name all on one line of output, I'm looking at one write statement. And so here I would do friend dash first name, comma, friend dash middle initial, friend dash last name. Now, there's a problem here, but let's at least see what we have when we save and look at this. And we can see an error message that I don't have enough screen real estate to display here, and that is a typing error that I frequently make, which is omitting that particular space after the slash. So give me a moment to clean that up. And here we are. Here's William T. Williams showing up, reflective of the structure that I have defined. But our problem, of course, is we need a dot after the middle initial. And so if we put that in, so I'll just introduce here a dot as one of my output elements. And of course, now we get something that's closer to the solution, but we see that after the letter T, we now have a space before the period, which is not what we desire. So of course, what I have to add to that is the instruction that after we output the middle initial, we want the system to inhibit putting the trailing separating space, that normally appears thereafter, and so now we have that output. So a couple of things here to make note of: the method of using no gap to inhibit white space around a data element when it is output was something you had to do a few different places in your homework, and then the issue of using one write statement for each line of output. Now, this wasn't part of your spec, but many of you observed in your code that you were putting together very, very long write statements. So let me kind of model that here by adding to this friend dash, and you can see already now my screen has started to scroll to the right, and I can't see the leftmost column here. What we want to do in this situation is, if you have rollover text, is what we'll call this, go ahead and go to the next line. But we have two choices here, neither of which is to continue adding to this write statement the way it is now. Choice number one is just to hit the tab key and space that over the normal spacing that a tab gives us in the SAP GUI IDE, which is 2 spaces. And I would then do friend-ID number, for example. So once again, I have one line of output, so this is going onto one write statement. I mentioned you have two choices. One was to do the standard indent, which is probably what I recommend, but equally acceptable would be to bring this over and indent it as you see it here, indicative of it being a chained statement. And so now you're lining up all the various lines of that write statement vertically there in that fashion. But either of those two techniques is fine. What I would suggest, though, is that the standard indenting is probably the more typical. And of course, the idea is that if I were to continue to have to add more things to this, so let's just assume for the sake of argument that for whatever reason I want to do this, okay? What I would do is whatever point I'm ready to move to the next line, I just pull that back down and am aligning all of my rollover lines accordingly, okay? Now, I don't know how some of you achieved this, but the intent is, when you are done with your program, for you to open up Microsoft Word and then to come back to your IDE and copy everything here except for the comment at the top. So we would grab all of this and then paste this into Microsoft Word. And now notice in my example here now, we see an illustration of something that I mentioned in the homework, which is my rollover lines are doing really weird things. So I'm going to solve that by changing the orientation of the paper to landscape. Now, the other reason why I'm seeing this is I've really increased the text size in my IDE for the sake of displaying it here. So what you would more likely see is something like this, and so now our lines break accordingly. For some reason, though, some of you, when you pasted your code into the Microsoft Word document, you lost all the syntax highlighting, and I'm not sure how that happened, but that's not desirable. You really want that syntax highlighting to be there for the sake of you referring back to this code in the future as a resource. And so definitely you want to try to preserve that. So let me look at my notes here. No gap we talked about. One write statement per line of output. We talked about indenting the rollover lines. Let's talk for a second here about the slash that we use for going to the beginning of a new line. What I have illustrated here on line 24 is the way we want that to look, which is to say that we almost always will put the slash at the beginning of a write statement. Some of you got to the end of your line of code and put a slash there. Although that's syntactically correct, you won't see ABAP developers do that. Don't do that. Put the slash at the beginning of your line of output. And when we start doing things where we put write statements in loops, you'll see that that makes our code much more cleaner. Some of you actually did something like this, where you would have a write statement, either chained or not, that was this like so. That can be really, really problematic from the perspective of, watch what happens now if I take this, and I'll go ahead and bump this /off right here. And let's save this, and let's kind of watch what happens here. We get this. So what are we looking at here that is notable? Yeah, I got a blank line between two lines of output. You know that. We don't want that to happen. When you create program output, you want everything to be single-spaced. When I put a slash on a line by itself, that's what that gives me. And that's why that is problematic, and that's why we don't do that. We always put the slash at the beginning of a write statement like you see here, and so now that is going to give me the expected single spacing here for my output. So that raises the question, suppose I do want a blank line. How do I get a blank line between these two? Yeah, I use the skip statement here. And I think, let's check here, I want to say that if we just use skip by itself, it's going to give me one blank line, or I could do skip and a number to put in a designated number of blank lines. But I don't want to use the slash, except as we're seeing it here in this code. Otherwise, I get very, very unusual things going on in my output. So be careful about that. One of the things we talked about last time as well was the idea of having like a header line at the top of output. So we might, for example, say in column 10, we want to output the text friend, or actually I'll just do first, and then jump over to column 30 and do middle, and then jump over to column 40 and do last. Obviously, I'm not going for beauty here in my output. I'm just illustrating a line of code here. And now the idea would be that the way we would want to output this in lines 25 and 27 is we would not want to repeat putting those numbers in. Why do we not want those why do we not want to continue using the numbers? It shouldn't start a diagonal pattern, I don't think, but I think somebody else was volunteering an answer.
If you change it later on your spacing, then that gets the whole.
Absolutely. If I had 15 subsequent write statements to the header, I've got to go through and fix those numbers in every place. So what I would do instead is I would say that this line should go under first, and this should go under, me and the caps locks key are not friends today, under middle, and lastly this is going to be under last. I'm not going to fix my rollover lines here just for the sake of time. And so I would see the alignment here as is indicated. And so the virtue of this is I look at this and say, oh, I don't like the way that's lined up. Let's move first back to column 5. Well, I only have to change that one line, and now everything else will automatically adjust to be under those header lines as desired. Most of you remembered, along with this, that the way we get an underline is the U-line statement. I did see some people do some very interesting things other than that, but the U-line is what we actually want to use there as our horizontal line of separator. Most of you in your code remembered the distinction between putting a number in a write statement and putting a number inside of parentheses. And the reality is, in the program that I gave you, a number in parentheses really did not need to be any part of your coding. Remember, the distinction is a number that stands by itself, as illustrated here, tells me to go to a particular column and begin my output. A number in parentheses has to do with how wide we allocate for spacing of the data object that follows this. So what I would be saying here is go to column 30 and output the word middle in a set of cells that are 12 characters wide. Well, that 12 adds no value at all to my program overall. It's in no way necessary here. And so, for some reason, some of you use those parentheses values when they really were not a part of something that you really needed for the sake of this program. Yes?
Some I noticed on mine where I used, instead of a string, I called them the type C and set the length. And I had to use the open paren star
Now that
paren because it would justify it to the right and how much I designated myself.
Now that is true, and I was going to mention the star as a special case here. That is the difference between, remember, a string is dynamic length. And so if you used a string in your program, you probably did not observe this. So let's look at this so that all of you can see this. If I do first name type C length, let's just be really, huge here and say length 100. Now we're going to not really see this because of how I have the columns lined up here. So let me make some adjustments here to my output, and let's get rid of this, and let's get rid of all of our understatements and see how actually this lines up in our output now. And we'll see something that is definitely worthy of our attention in understanding how to resolve. So I'm going to reduce this to just one line of output. I think I've pruned this enough. And so notice now, when we dump this to output, I get William and then this huge amount of white space here, and that's because it's writing the text out where William is left aligned in a set of 100 characters of output. So notice that that is totally different than if I said William was type string. As soon as I use string here, remember the length of the data is the length of the actual characters themselves. So a kind of nice side effect of using string here. But if I do want to use C, which is equally valid in most contexts, then what I have to remember to do is I've got to come here to first name and I've got to say to get rid of those extraneous spaces, I use a star in the parentheses, and I always forget whether there's supposed to be a space there or not, so I'll do a syntax check. Yep, I passed the syntax check, and so now we get William T. Williams just like we anticipated. So once again, I would not put a number in here, but if you used C as your data type, the star is definitely going to need to be a part of that solution. Anything else you ran into in doing your homework that might have raised some questions? All right, well, my hope is that we will cover enough today that I can give you your next homework assignment when we get together on Thursday, and similarly give you a set of days over the weekend to be able to take that on. Any questions about anything before we jump back into our discussion here in ABAP programming concepts, which we really just have a couple more short things to talk about. Yes, sir, Ben. Okay.
Regarding the IDE, is there a way to, because I've done this like 75 times now, where I double click on a word trying to highlight it, and I would like to highlight it, but it does something else.
Yeah, it employs what's called forward navigation, and the answer is, to the best of my knowledge, no. Now, having said that, though, I confess that I have not played around with all of the options that come to me when we click on this little icon here in the very bottom right. And so I don't know if there's anything here that would change the behavior of double clicking, but I will say that double clicking, like you're finding, will actually become your best friend in the future. So yeah, it's just a habit you have to break yourself of. And after you do it about 15,000 times, you will eventually break yourself of that habit. Other questions? All right, so we are missing one major part of our skill set for being able to write basic ABAP programs, and that is, how can we get data from the user at runtime? How can we take in user input? Well, we do that by way of the parameters statement. And what the parameter statement does is it will prompt the user to enter data that we then capture in a data object, capture in a variable for use in our program. Now, what we are going to have happen when we employ the parameter statement is we are going to get a selection screen. And ABAP is smart enough to give us a selection screen if we need one because we've used the parameter statement, and not give us one if it's not a part of our program. So, parameter statement looks exactly like a data statement, can use user-defined types just like a data statement, but employs the word parameters instead of the word data as the keyword at the beginning of the statement. Just like you are seeing illustrated here, I can do this as a chained statement, or I can do this as a standalone statement, either of which is equally valid. So if I come back to the program that I have right here, let's see, for example, well, I can't exactly reuse my structure for reasons that I will explain more in just a moment, but I'll go ahead and leave it here as a part of my program. But I will come up here, I'll bump off, or actually I'll just comment out this write statement. Oh, by the way, if you're ever in the IDE and you're writing some code and you want to comment out a large block of code, you really don't have a block comment symbol in ABAP. You basically can just comment out one line at a time. But if you highlight a block of text and then right-click, one of the options that you will find is Format, Comment Out Lines, and that will comment them out. And similarly, you can highlight a block of lines, right-click, Format, Uncomment Lines. So that's kind of a nice feature. And so in this situation, I can not only comment out the lines, but I can also roll them up to get them from taking up so much screen real estate using that little plus in a box that appears to the left of that code block here. So I want to introduce a parameter statement into my code. Let me go ahead and get rid of this write statement because it's not doing anything for me at the moment, but I'll go ahead and keep it here. So parameters, and I want to ask the user for two things. I want to ask them for their name and their age. So I'll do parameters name, type string, and then come to the next line. And normally with the parameter statement, with the chain statement, I'll line it up as you see here, age, type I. And so I'll always take care to save this before I run any program. And you'll now see that when I run this, I get the prompting that you see here. And so for age, or excuse me, for name, William T. Kirk, age 147, and the user has to hit the execute button, which at that point control will be returned to my program, and those values will be stored in those data objects. Now note that if we come here to age and I start banging on alphabetic characters, nothing actually happens. So the IDE is smart enough to inhibit only numbers from being put in there. Now you might look at that and say, well, would there be a way for me to limit the age that a user could type in realizing that 123 is perhaps pretty unlikely for an age. Later on in the semester, we'll talk about techniques that we could use for limiting what the user can type in. There are a few different techniques we could employ. So I execute this now, and I think that this is because I don't actually do anything in my program. Whoops. So let me go back here, and let's, after the parameter statement, tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and wipe these guys out. They're not adding anything to the party here. And we're going to write out, not root out, write name, name, and I know I have a syntax error I've got to fix there, colon, age, and I haven't taken care to space this out in pretty fashion, but let's run this again and see what happens now here. Bob, me and the caps lock key are not friends today. Bob Smith, age 17, execute, and there's my output. And you can see, first of all, I want to see if you notice a couple things going on here. I will fix the fact that this should be going to a new line. Watch what I type very carefully and watch what I get as output. We'll do name, Brian T. Noland, and I have no idea how old he is, so we'll go with 42. Notice anything? It turned his name into all caps. Okay, we're going to have to figure out how to resolve that here, but that is something to note about what happens with the parameter statement when it takes in string data. And curiously enough, notice when I go back to this screen, it has changed what I have typed to appearing in all capital letters. But it clearly did take the input from me. If I wanted to make this look a little bit nicer in output, I'll put in a column specifier here for the sake of our continuing to run this as we go along. Now, there's one very odd facet of the parameter statement, and that is the name of the parameter, meaning the name of the data object, has to be 8 characters or less. So on my slide here, I have age, var1 and var2, which are consistent with that. They're all less than 8 characters. But if I wanted the parameter to be first name, F-I-R-S-T-N-A-M-E, that's clearly longer than 8 characters. F-I-R-S-T, yeah, by 1. That's going to be problematic for us. So I do have to recognize that I have to adhere to this 8-character convention. The other thing which you might have noticed is whatever the name of the data object is what shows up on the screen, which in my example, where I'm asking the person for their name and age, that's okay. But if I want to ask the user for his or her birthday, let's look at that because that's kind of an interesting one here. I can't do birthday, actually B-I-R-T-H-D-A. Yeah, birthday does actually work. So let's call this, just for example, your birthday, okay? To illustrate that this is going to be problematic for us, I'm not matching up with my 8 characters here, and so that's going to be flagged as an error. If I do bump this back to birthday, I'm within the 8-character limit, and so we should be okay. Watch what happens here. Name, age, 14, birthday, and we might have to actually do something a little bit different. that we'll come back to. But I want to show you what happens when I use D here in the future as we go along. We can actually change the way the prompting here appears for the user. So, have to adhere to that kind of odd 8-character element. Well, I can specify default value if I am so inclined to do, and this would be similar to pre-initializing a variable to a value. So it's similar to the values statement that we have seen in the data statement before, but here in the context of the parameter statement, what this is going to do is this is going to pre-populate the box with the value that is specified, but the user could change it. So I could, for example, and I don't know why you would want to do this, but I could do default 17. And in this case now, when the user is prompted, the number 17 is pre-populated. Once again, not a great design decision on my part here, but illustrative of how we could actually do this. And the user, of course, is free to actually change this. Now, the other thing that comes into play here is I've asked the user to give me their name, their age, and their birthday. Suppose they give me their name, but they don't want to give me their age and birthday, and they just hit execute. They really have kind of messed up my program here, because not putting a value in is taken as the default value for whatever the data type was. I'm using an integer for age. The default value for an integer is 0, so that's problematic. So how do I solve that? If there are elements of my input that the user has to enter, I can force them to do so by adding the keyword obligatory. And of course, even though it's not illustrated on my slide, I could still have a default clause here in addition to that. But what this is going to do now is if I go back and say, okay, the name is obligatory, and the age has a default value of 17, and it's obligatory, but we'll leave birthday to be optional in this situation. What you're going to see now is a couple of things. First of all, in the fields, we see a symbolic convention that is common in the SAP GUI, which is when a value is required, you get that square with a check mark in it as a visual cue to the user that they have to put something in there. And if the user says, okay, I'll give you my name as Tom, but I'm not going to give you an age, notice when they hit the execute button, they get this message at the bottom, fill out all required entry fields. So it won't let the user continue until they have given us all of the data there. So this now becomes an important part of our design, which is we need to figure out what fields truly are required and what fields might be optional. And if it's a situation where in order for my program to run, I really need this certain data to come from the user, then I have a nice way of forcing them to give me data without my having to worry about that as a part of the code that I write. I just force them to put it in on the front end. There are some other features here. For example, we observed that this is turning the user's first name to all capital letters. Well, how do we fix that? And I want to once again remind you of our friend here, which is highlighting or selecting a word and hitting the F1 key will give me text or give me documentation here. And in this situation here, I can look at the quick reference and see all of the different things that go along with the parameter statement. And anybody notice anything in the various options there that look like they might give us the ability to control case? Yeah, notice that lower case that's right here as one of the key words. And in fact, I think if we scroll down, we would see the documentation for that. Lowercase prevents the conversion of the contents of character-like field to uppercase when transferring data between the input field and the data object. And if I click on this, it will actually give me additional documentation about this, and including here some sample code. We won't look at that in great detail, but notice if I come back here to name and I just add the modifier here, lowercase. Now what that's going to do is it's not going to convert everything the user types into lowercase, but it's going to open up the potential to accept lowercase letters. So now if the user types Fred Smith, it comes in mixed case. So the point of this is I showed you one of the myriad of options that we can employ with the parameter statement. You might, if you weren't paying attention, not have noticed what the system was doing with converting the type to uppercase. When we ran it a few minutes ago, some of you really quickly noticed it and some of you probably didn't notice any different. This is a good example of where we need to get in the habit of run testing our programs, seeing what they're doing, and then if we don't like what we see, then go in and fix it. Because this is something that clearly, for a user's name, we would want case sensitivity to be a part of this. Questions about this so far?
If you had a data type structure and you used that in a param statement, would that work?
If you got lucky and your structure, including the name of the data object, the dash, and the name of the field, matched up with the 8-character limit, you'd be okay. But chances are pretty good you would not have that be the case. So it is not unusual to have to fill data objects and then copy them elsewhere as one of the first things that you do in your program to populate a structure, for example. Good, very good question. Now notice here my prompting is sufficient, if you will, because I have data object names like name, age, and birthday. But notice, first of all, it put them on the screen in all uppercase letters. And we still haven't addressed the issue where suppose I need to give the user prompting that would require more explanation than I can do in just 8 alphabetic characters. Well, we are now getting ready to meet something new that's a part of the ABAP environment, which is called the text pool. And we'll see that this is used not only for what we're about to illustrate here, but at some point later in the semester, I'll show you how this is used to actually write a program that can be multilingual and will prompt the user differently depending upon what language they've logged into the system as. So if I want to change what are called these selection texts that are part of the text pool, the first thing I have to do is I have to activate the program. So I've already saved the program here. Now I come back and I activate it. Notice I have 2 programs here, but I'm working in this first one here. So that's all I need to highlight, and so I will activate it. So now having activated that, I go to, in the menu, go to text elements, and then I choose selection text. And notice here that we see a table, if you will, that lists all of our parameters, and then next to it at the moment, there's this question mark ... Well, here's what I do. I type in what I want the prompting to say. And notice as well that these are given to me in alphabetic order, not necessarily the order in which they appear in my program. So this could be, for example, enter your age, enter, I misspelled your, enter your age, enter your birthday, enter your name. Save this, and now I have to activate the selection text. So I activate once again, and now that has been activated, I can go back to my program and notice now when I run this, my prompting has changed. Enter your name, enter your age, enter your birthday. So once again, we'll do something else. Frida, Freeport, age 22. And you'll notice that there is a way, if I were to do certain things in my code, for me to get a date pop up like you've seen in other applications where the user can pop up a little calendar and actually select a date. I won't show you how to do that at the moment, but that's another modifier that can be part of the parameter statement to have that happen. What you will undoubtedly forget this semester, and I do this as well, is notice if I come back here now and I change this, and I add a new parameter here, we'll call it, I don't know, other type string. So notice now if I save this and execute it, I get my first three text fields, and then other just shows up there. And if you're not paying attention as well, now you go back and say, oh, I need to fix that other. So I go to text elements, selection text, and other is not a part of it. And that's because I haven't activated the program. So when I activate the program, that adds all of my parameters to this table. And then in order to have this settings go into effect, I have to activate it after making that modification as well. So there's our first instance of having to activate something other than just the program itself in order to have something be a part of our coding. Questions? Well, that wraps up our discussion of ABAP programming concepts. So we are getting close to actually being able to write programs of some sophistication, but we are missing one very big element here, which is the ability to introduce conditional logic into our programs. And so our next discussion will take us through conditional code in ABAP, and then we will also talk about a data structure that we will make very frequent and extensive use of this semester, which is an internal table. I don't know that we'll get to internal tables today, but certainly we can cover a lot of things related to conditional code. So, logical expressions. Just to do a brief recap to set the stage here. If you've done any programming at all, which all of you have worked with logical expressions. A logical expression is a statement that evaluates to either true or false. So we might say, for example, x is less than 5. Well, that's a logical expression, and we could evaluate the truth or falseness of that particular proposition. It is worth noting that many programming languages have a Boolean data type, or they permit you to work with things in a manner that approximates a Boolean data type. For example, Pascal has a Boolean data type, so you can assign true or false to a particular data object. In C, you don't have a Boolean data type, but you could put a logical expression on the right side of an equal sign, and the variable on the left will be set to 1 if the expression is true, or 0 if the expression is false. Can't do that in ABAP. ABAP does not have the ability to store the results of a logical expression in a variable. So we just put them directly in the statement where we have our conditional code. So logical expressions are themselves embedded in these conditional code sequences. And we'll look at the syntax for that in just a moment. Our logical operators in ABAP are ones that you are undoubtedly familiar with from other programming languages, although our symbology here is different in a couple of cases. Notice we have the operator equals, or EQ, so we have text equivalents for every one of our operators that we use. Or we have, notice the one that's different from, let's say, Java, for example, is not equal. This is not the exclamation mark. We do not use the exclamation mark for not in ABAP. So we use the more typical algebraic not equal, which is the less than and greater than symbol back to back one another. And you see the rest of the table there. We also have Boolean operators and, or, and not. Yes?
Yes, sir. Can you put not equals in terms of variable? Just
Absolutely. Yeah, you could do X and EY, and we'll see that for checking to see whether X is not equal to Y. So, you know, my only admonition is pick one in a given program that you write and stick with it. But there's really, if you like the text equivalents, use the text. If you like the symbols, use the symbols. But as far as how they're placed in code, works exactly the same. Not would look like what you see here, not tax LT sales. So this is not a complete sentence or line of code, but you can see that the evaluation here is tax is less than sales, and this is going to do that evaluation and then flip the results through the inclusion of the not. So we won't take a lot of time to go through how you would incorporate this into your code, because I trust you have worked with all of these before, and so all we're introducing here is a different syntax for your code. So let's look at how we incorporate this into our programs through the very common if statement. And here's the way an if statement looks in ABAP. We have the keyword if, and then we have a logical expression. If A less than B, if X less than 5, other things of that sort. That's our logical expression. Then the body of this is one or more statements. And then we have, to end the if block, the statement end if. Now there are at least two notable things about this that differ from other programming languages. Can anybody identify one of those things? Okay, there's no parentheses or other notation around the logical expression. The logical expression just sits there at the end of the line. That would be one difference. What else is different? Yes, sir.
In bash script, if then 5 is the end, but I don't think it ends each line of code or period.
That is most typically correct in just about every programming language I'm familiar with, except for ABAP, where if you put the statement terminator at the end of the first line here, at the end of the if, you shoot yourself in the foot, because the body of that if statement is a null statement, and the lines that follow it then aren't actually conditional. So ABAP is somewhat unique in that every one of those statements does end with a period. And there's one other big difference here. Yes? Yes, we don't have curly braces, or in some programming languages you use a begin and end as explicit text. Notice the way this works in ABAP is there's an inherent assumption that the body of this will be as many lines of code as you would like, but whether it's one line of conditional code or 50 lines of conditional code, we always end it with an end if statement. So our code might look something like this. If var A, LT var B, write var A, end if. Notice how I have indented this. The ABAP IDE, when you hit the tab key, will tab over two spaces, so you can see that that's what's illustrated here. We do indent the rollover lines that make up the body of the if statement, and then we always bring the end if back to line up with the if statement that relates to it. So that's a simple if statement. Here's an if statement with an else clause. If logical expression, however many statements go with the true path of that logical expression, and now we have added a false path. Notice a couple of things here, and here's some sample code. If var A less than var B, write var A, else write var B. And if. So notice the end if appears at the end of the overall block. So there's no, it's not if, end if, else, and else. The end if contains the entire conditional code sequence, And the way we denote the true portion from the false portion is by placing in just the keyword else. And notice, of course, the else has a period associated with it. Well, there's one more variation here that's pretty common, which is introducing an embedded conditional statement. So notice the way we do this. It is not else space if. It's its own dedicated keyword, else if. All is one word. So we have an if statement with a true block for that. If the initial if is false, then we go to the second if statement and evaluate that, and we could have a true block or a standard else block that goes with that else if statement. So this would be an example of a code sequence that looks like this. Questions or comments? All right, so code that, once again, I'm assuming that you have written in other programming languages. The big distinction here, of course, for us is the way the keywords are managed and the way the statement terminator symbols are included in the code sequence itself. We have another conditional code statement that we will frequently use in ABAP. It's not as used as the if statement, either in ABAP or other programming languages, but the case statement is one that I am assuming you have seen in programs that you have written before. And the way ABAP interprets the case statement is really kind of different. But let's start with the basic idea. We have the keyword case, and then the variable or data object that the case statement is based on. So let's say, for example, we were going to give the user a menu of choices labeled 1 through 5, and they would enter one of those values, and depending upon what they put in, we do something different. So we might have a when clause for when 1, when 2, when 3, when 4, and when so on. So we have the case statement. At the end, we have the end case. And then we have a sequence of when statements with the option, if we would desire this, to have a default clause called when others that serves if none of the other explicitly specified values matches up with what the user has put in. So for example, I could do something like this, where I have perhaps asked the user to load a value into var a by way of a parameter statement, and when they've put in the number 1, we're going to write out on the screen the word uno. When they put in the number 2, we're going to write out the word dos, and that's all the Spanish we know, so if they put in another number, we just write out the word other in this particular example. What is unique about ABAP, and I'll put this on the whiteboard, and I'm not encouraging you to do this, but I'm simply saying that as possible, we can do something like this. And when I write on the whiteboard, I'll probably write mixed case most of the time. Just translate that in your head. We can do something like this. Case 7, when var a, and then have something, and then when var b, and then have something. So it's kind of like I flip the case structure on its head, and we can do that in ABAP. And what's going to happen here is it's going to just work sequentially through the when statements until it finds the first one that matches. And if, of course, it doesn't find any that matches, I could have a when others clause down here that would pick everything else up. So the idea here would be if var a is equal to 7, we're going to do whatever this is. And by the way, we always only take one when pathway. So if var a matched up with the 7, we would do this block of code and then would jump out of the case statement. Not saying that you'll have occasion to use this, but it is something that ABAP permits that I'm not aware of any other programming language that allows us to do that. Questions about the case statement?
Is
All right, to make sure I understand, can you run the scenario by me again?
It's just kind of with random thought, like if you had, say you wanted to output for this even number, or if it's a one-digit number, like say if it's
I think you would have to employ an if statement for that, because this is really just focused on a straight matching of equality and not anything more robust than that. But it is kind of ironic, the example that you gave, because the next thing that I wanted us to do is take a second here and write a program together. And here's what I would like the program to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes head start to work on your paper and try and write this program out, and then we will work on this together. So I would like you to write a program that prompts the user for 2 values. If the sum of those 2 numbers is even, I want you to print out even. If the sum of those 2 numbers is odd, I want you to print out odd. And after you do that, I want you to compare the sum to the following. If the sum is 7, print magic number. If the sum is 14, print double magic. Otherwise, print no magic for you. Okay? So not a long program, but go ahead and write that real quick. I'll give you a couple of minutes, and then we will work on this together. All right, I realize you may not be finished, but hopefully you've made a good dent in the code. Let's take a moment and work on this together, and you can kind of compare the code here to yours. And what I will do is use this as a way to talk about some variations that we could employ as well. So first thing, of course, here is we need a parameters statement. And we're going to take in 2 values from the user. So I think this would be a good place for us to use a chained parameter statement. And notice one decision that I'll make right away is I'll just call this var A for the first one, and I'll do type I, and then var B type I. And the spec didn't really specify whole numbers, but I think probably most of you in your coding assume that because of the concept of even and odd. Notice one very nice thing that happens here with my putting this into ABAP in this fashion is when I run this, if I try and type 3.5, 3.5, well, what's going to actually happen here is decimal places are not permitted. So the user won't actually be able to enter in decimal numbers, so they're going to have to change that, and now they can execute it. And I don't have any subsequent code, but so far we're pretty good here. But there's probably something missing from my code at this point, which is what? Obligatory. How many of you had obligatory written on your piece of paper? Couple of you. So it's really easy to overlook here, but clearly for you to be able to fulfill the purpose of your program, the user's going to have to give you 2 numbers. So this is a great example of where obligatory should be a part of the parameter statement, because otherwise my program's not going to work right. So don't forget that. You don't put it every time in, but clearly in a situation like this where we have to get 2 numbers, I suppose the scenario would be ask the user for 2 or 3 numbers and sum them, and then do the logic here. Well, in that case, you could make the first 2 obligatory and make the third not obligatory, in which case the third number would be presumed to be 0, and our specification would be okay. So we have this. So now let's explore this idea. If the sum of those 2 numbers is even, print even. If the sum is odd, print odd. So we'll look at a variety of ways we could do this. We could do if var A plus var B. Well, what do we do now? How do we figure out even or not? Okay, if I do mod 2, all right, what's the rest of this? Okay, what? Okay, All right, so this is something that we might see in some programs, and let's see what happens here. Var A plus var B mod 2 equals 0. Then what does that tell us about this number? It's even. Okay, so write even. All right, and can't ever forget, not end with, end if. Okay, so let's save this. And let's throw this at the ABAP checker. And this is really interesting. And I'm going to, let's execute this and see if it works the way we'd hoped. 3 and 3 execute. Not getting any output here. That's kind of curious. Let's do this just for fun. Write hi. All right, so let's just see, let's put something in here outside of my conditional code. 3, execute hi. What's going on here? Well, anybody have any suggestions? Okay, so let's try and add some parentheses here. So let's put this, maybe if var A plus var B, if we do that, mod 2 equals 0. Notice I've, got to space this out. All right, so let's see. Put in 3 and 3, and now I get even, okay? So you can see that kind of oddly, a moment ago, the rules of precedence actually caused us to get the wrong answer here until we put those parentheses in. Now, let me tell you something that makes your life a lot easier. We are running the very latest version of the ABAP compiler. 2 minor versions ago, so calendar-wise, about a year and a half ago, the language changed. You used to not be able to do math in an if statement. And so this guy would be totally out the window. We would not be able to do that at all. But ABAP now does let us do math in an if statement. So this will work fine for us. Now, what we don't have here is the alternative, which is odd. And so I would now need to introduce an else clause. Looks kind of odd, just the word else by itself, but with a period after it. Write odd. Should get in the habit of putting a slash here. So I'll go ahead and model that. Get rid of the word, or get rid of the hi statement here. Don't really need that anymore. So now 3, execute even. 3, 4, execute odd. So my code does seem to be working correctly. So as it stands, this is perfectly syntactically fine code. But what's interesting is now we look at our next thing that we're supposed to do here, which is if the sum is 7, if the sum is 14, and so on. Well, generally speaking, you want to avoid having the computer do the same calculation twice. So one way we could solve that is to introduce a new variable called sum, and perhaps on line 9, introduce that new data object, and then on line 10, say sum equals var A plus var B, and then on line 10 that's there now, if sum mod 2 equals 0, we could reduce it in that fashion. But let's look at some other alternatives here to see what might actually work for us. Suppose we did this. Now we're just experimenting here. Case var A plus var B, period. And then in my case statement, I have a sequence of when clauses. So the first thing the slide said is do this when it's 7. So I'll do when 7, write out slash magic number. And then to end a particular when statement, I just add the next when statement. So when And then the next one was 14, write double magic. And then it said if you don't get either one of those, so this would be when others write no magic for you. And now I need to end my case statement. And you will see happen a lot in our ABAP coding that our blocks do frequently have a statement that begins it and then an end whatever that terminates that sequence. Well, let's see if this in fact works for us here. So I will run this and we'll do 3 and 4. So I should see odd and then magic number. And in fact I do. Odd magic number. If I put in something that sums to 14, so if I do 7 plus 7, I should see even and double magic, and I do. And then if I do anything else, 7 and 8, then that's going to be odd and no magic for you because it doesn't match there. So notice the kind of unusual way that ABAP allows us to make use of the case statement that I would suggest to you many other programming languages would perhaps not support in this same fashion. Questions about this? All right, let me show you one more thing in the 10 minutes or so that we have left here, which is the ABAP debugger, which is pretty useful and something I would encourage you as the semester goes on to incorporate into your troubleshooting processes as you perhaps have a program that's not behaving the way that you think it ought to behave. So the first thing to note is before we can debug a program, we have to actually save and activate that program. So I will save and activate this particular program. And then once I've done that, what I have the ability to do is insert into my program what is called a breakpoint. And we'll observe what that actually does here in just a second. But the way that I put a breakpoint in is I just take my mouse cursor and move it to the end of a line of code and double click on that line to introduce a breakpoint. And for some reason, I'm not getting a breakpoint. I have discovered that with my making the text larger, I get weird kind of visual artifacts like these tiny buttons and such on my screen here. And for some reason,
You need to do it in that like beige area to the left of where your cursor is.
yes. Thank you. And that is the tiniest little stop sign. That looks like a little stop sign there. And man, it made that region so tiny that thank you for calling that to my attention. I didn't even notice that there. I thought it was just part of the separator bar. Okay, so the idea is I have now put in a breakpoint on line 10. So what's going to happen when I run my program is it's going to run up to line 10, and then it's going to shell me out, if you will, to the debugger. So let's see what actually happens here. I'm going to run the program and ask me var A and var B, and I'm going to do 3 and 4, and then I'm going to hit execute, and now it hits the line of code where the debugger is, and so now I'm now in debugger mode. In debugger mode, you see my source codes here on the left. I've got all kinds of different tabs and screen portions here, lots of stuff going on. But one of the things that I can see is that right now I'm on line number 10. My cursor is flashing there. And I could, for example, check and see what the value of var A and var B are right now. And I can do that by just coming up here to a reference for var A and double click on it. And it adds it to this table down here on the bottom left, or bottom right, excuse me, and var B. And I can now see that the user has put in 3 and 4. Now at this point, for the sake of testing, Suppose I wanted to change those values and say, okay, pretend the user put in something else. I can come down here to this window and I can actually change this value to 14. And so now the program's going to continue to run as if var b was 14. And it's going to now allow me to step through the code depending upon which of these buttons that I click here at the top. Notice I have single step, execute, and return, and continue. All right, so let's do single step. So it's going to, it did this evaluation, and you might have a hard time seeing it because it's so tiny on the screen, but there's a little arrowhead there that tells me that it jumped down to line 13 because it did its evaluation and came to the conclusion that odd is the right answer there. And so now I can click on single step, and it jumps down to the next actual line of code. And so now I could say, oh, I want to test this and see what happens when the case is 7. So I can come back here to var A and var B, and I could change this to 3 and 4. And then I can do a single step. And notice now it took the when 7 pathway. So if you've ever had a scenario where you have conditional code and you want to see, okay, how's it doing the evaluation? Which path is it taking? Well, the debugger is excellent for that because I could set a breakpoint just right in my code right before what I want to take a look at. I run my program. When it gets to that line, it pops up this cockpit for debugging. I can put watches on whatever old variables I wanted to, see what those actually are, and then kind of play along with the computer the execution of the program. Now, the really great thing about this that we're going to see is we have very simple data types here. But in the future, if we send a command, let's say, to the database, and we want to see what the database has sent back to us, the debugger gives us a way to look at the value of returns from the database, or actually look at very, very complicated data types. In this situation, we just have a couple of very simple integer variables to actually look at here. There are some other things that we really don't care about here, but you can see, for example, the name of our program and other things that are going on. SY-tabix and SY-subrc are something that I think we'll probably talk about next time we get together. Notice there at the top as well, it does tell us what line we're actually on, if you kind of can't see that enormous arrow that's there at the left of the screen. I think, you know, if you ran this on your laptop or whatever, you'd see it actually looks a little bit better proportionally than what we're looking at here. The key is, too, when you're kind of done, it's like, okay, at this point, I'm done. Let's imagine there were 500 more lines of code. I wouldn't want to sit here and single step through all 500 of those lines. If I do execute, what it does here, and we've got to be careful about this, sometimes let's say, for example, I used a function here. Well, the code for the function might jump to another ABAP module that's written by the system. This will trace into code that I did not write. So you may sometimes see that happen, and the way you avoid that is with the continue statement, which is the execute statement. It will not execute foreign code, but just execute your code that you have written. But the very last one here that's continue, when I click on that, it just runs to the end of the program at that point. Or, if I wanted to, I could have a breakpoint here on line 10, and then maybe another breakpoint on line 21, in which case that would allow me to stop, and then I could hit continue, and it would execute the code down to the second breakpoint if it hits it in this instance, and allow me to look at things in the debugger there. There's a whole chapter in your book related to the debugger that you will read later this semester, but I wanted to introduce it to you at this point because it is something that may come in handy in your testing of your programs. When we get together next time, we will talk about looping, and then after that, we'll start talking about internal tables, which will enable us to finally start doing some very interesting things in our ABAP programming. If you didn't sign in, make sure you do that. And I'll look forward to seeing you guys when we get together on Thursday.